Okay. Kwai, bonjour, greetings. First of all, I want to thank my old friend Wayne Flaman for the kind introduction. It's always wonderful to see a fellow Manitoban, fellow Winnipegger, Red River Métis, and a former boxer in another province, another town. So thank you so much, Wayne. I want to acknowledge with respect that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I must thank Shannon Mateta-Wabin, Jean-Vincent, and everyone at the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association for the opportunity to be part of your second annual Indigenous Prosperity Forum. I have to congratulate nacca and the Aboriginal Financial Institution members for the success you enable year after year by providing vital support services and access to the capital that Indigenous entrepreneurs need to start and to grow a business. And that support is having an incredible impact. Over the last year, Aboriginal financial institutions approved $125 million in development loans to Indigenous entrepreneurs. That capital was fundamental to the creation of 1,158 businesses. And I'm pleased to note that 36% of those new businesses were started by women. Au pays, seulement 16% des entreprises canadiennes sont détenues ou gérées par des femmes. Des études démontrent que l'augmentation de la participation des femmes à l'économie canadienne pourra faire accroître le PIB de 150 millions de dollars. C'est la raison pour laquelle notre gouvernement investit également dans la stratégie pour les femmes en entrepreneuriat pour doubler le nombre d'entreprises détenues par des femmes. And it's estimated that the role AFIs play in business startup and expansion contributes to the creation of some 4,000 jobs every year, support local economies with more jobs and more opportunities. Our government is committed to working with Indigenous organizations and communities to co-develop strategies to accelerate closing the unacceptable socioeconomic gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. Without Indigenous economic development, closing the gap and achieving reconciliation are simply not possible. Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs are key drivers in economic development, contributing to both employment and wealth creation, which are in turn fundamental to the importance, independence, and sustainability of Indigenous communities. A few months ago, releasing the National Indigenous Economic Development Board's 2019 Indigenous Economic Progress Report, Chief Clarence Louie of Osoyoos Indian Band reminded all of us, and I quote, "Indigenous economic development offers huge potential to improve lives, fuel Canadian economic growth, advance reconciliation, and provide a growing young workforce to Canada's aging labour population. Closing this gap would boost Canada's economy by $27.7 billion every year." As the report goes on to say, with a young and growing Indigenous population, Indigenous economic development is a powerful, untapped resource to drive Canada's future economic growth. I could not agree more. And that is one of the main reasons why I led the development of the country's first Aboriginal youth strategy in Winnipeg. There was a need for support, and by pulling together resources to help in employment, internships, literacy, physical and mental well-being, we were able to help a large segment of our population succeed. And Winnipeg is not a fast growth city. It's not like Toronto or Vancouver. But the fastest growing demographic in Winnipeg are young Indigenous people, Métis, First Nation, and Inuit. And at the same time, the City of Winnipeg Corporation's workforce is growing older, and the general workforce of our city is growing older. So the key is to connect those dots between a young, fast-growing Indigenous population, which provides many challenges, and we all know about those challenges, but also tremendous opportunity. And that's where I see, that was the impetus for the youth strategy, and that's where I see a potential role for your organization and your AFIs in connecting those dots. But let me get back to the speech. The board's report further identified a lack of access to capital as an issue, and I want to recognize the tremendous job AFIs are doing to remove the barrier for hundreds of Indigenous entrepreneurs each and every year. And we also recognize that AFIs themselves face barriers in demand for their services and for loans. And our government responded with a budget 2019 commitment of $100 million to establish the Indigenous Growth Fund. The Indigenous Growth Fund is a new innovative fund created through a partnership between BDC and nacca that will leverage government investment to raise additional capital from institutional investors. The fund will make affordable capital available to AFIs to provide loans to new and expanding Indigenous businesses. And I want to thank nacca for their advocacy and their leadership to establish this fund. And with this new fund, AFIs will be able to provide hundreds more Indigenous entrepreneurs a year with access to the capital they need to start a new business or to expand. We are complementing our investment in the fund with a commitment to invest a further $17 million over 3 years to expand the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program. This investment will support Indigenous entrepreneurs and the AFIs that serve them by increasing access to equity capital and business support services, and help further the culture of entrepreneurship in Indigenous communities. Comme nous le savons tous, établir une entreprise prospère ne se limite pas à l'accès aux capitaux. Le déficit en matière d'infrastructure dans les communautés autochtones et du Nord est un obstacle de taille au développement économique. Qu'il s'agisse des pistes de décollage, des routes, ponts, logements, systèmes énergétiques, télécommunications, écoles ou hôpitaux, les infrastructures sont les fondations sur lesquelles les communautés s'appuient et se développent. Our government recognizes the essential need to address the pressing infrastructure needs of Indigenous and Northern communities. Last year, our government announced a $1.6 million contribution to the Kivalliq Inuit Association for the completion of a feasibility study for a hydro-fiber optic line from northern Manitoba to the Kivalliq region of Nunavut. That link would provide a more reliable energy source, would reduce the region's dependence on fossil fuels, and deliver a faster and more stable internet service. And just a few weeks ago, an MOU was signed to continue to move this important project forward. The Prime Minister has made it very clear that infrastructure in Indigenous communities is an absolute priority. And this is where my mandate as Minister of Northern Affairs is unique, in that my focus is on an entire region, a vast region, as opposed to a subject. We need to bring a whole-of-government approach to finding solutions with Northern partners, not only when it comes to critical infrastructure and housing, but economic development, climate change, education, and mental health. We will work to co-develop and invest in distinctions-based community infrastructure plans to address critical needs, including housing, all-weather roads, high-speed internet, health facilities, treatment centers, and schools in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities by 2030. This must be done by considering the impacts of climate change, especially given the rate of warming in the north is 3 times greater than the rest of Canada. This affects critical infrastructure, housing, businesses, but also has a huge impact on traditional lifestyles, including hunting and gathering. The melting ice and eroding coastlines are affecting communities, and it is here that traditional Indigenous knowledge of the land combined with entrepreneurship, could help in mitigating the impacts of climate change and protecting the environment. I'd also like to mention the federal procurement strategy for Aboriginal business, which our government has made a priority. Since it was launched in 1996, more than 100,000 contracts have been awarded to Indigenous suppliers worth a total of $1.5 billion. Il ne fait aucun doute que l'attribution de ces contrats a favorisé la croissance de nombreuses entreprises autochtones. Celles-ci prennent de l'expansion et se multiplient. Mais en même temps, 70% d'entre elles demeurent dans la catégorie des petites ou moyennes entreprises et il est difficile pour les PME de s'y retrouver dans le processus complexe d'approvisionnement établi par le gouvernement fédéral. And that's why our government is working with Public Services and Procurement Canada to streamline and bring clarity to procurement processes in general and to look at ways to build the Indigenous capacity to bid. And that has to include finding ways to do more Indigenous benefits plans in large contracts. And as you know, we've completed an extensive engagement with a wide range of stakeholders, including nacca, and we are looking forward to offering recommendations for improvements based on those consultations. The mandate letters that Prime Minister Trudeau released in December 2019 has asked the Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada, with the support of the Minister of Indigenous Services and the President of the Treasury Board, to, and I quote, create more opportunities for Indigenous businesses to succeed and grow by creating a new target to have at least 5% of federal contracts awarded to businesses managed and led by Indigenous peoples. Now, I am, and my government is fully committed to working with all partners, stakeholders, and with my colleagues to achieve the 5% target in a timely manner. We want federal procurement from Indigenous businesses to go to $1 billion over 25 years to $1 billion each and every year. It's simply an important priority for our government. I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. I look forward to continuing our conversation, particularly how we can partner together moving forward to address the urgent needs of the North, including building infrastructure, keeping the North connected, fighting climate change, supporting Indigenous-led businesses, and continuing to grow our economy. If a region, partner, or community is left behind and not provided the opportunity to grow, then our entire country is not living up to our full potential, and we know there is much, much more work to do. I look forward to our continuing conversation. Miigwech, thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Minister Van Dal, I'd like to thank you very much for making this presentation, and we'd like to give you a small presentation here as a token of our appreciation.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Be 2 seconds. We're going to be starting another panel shortly.
And let's praise your wonderfulness.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and I want to acknowledge that we're on Algonquin territory, and I'm very pleased to be able to do this panel with you. Procurement is something I'm very passionate about. So I'm just going to introduce the group to come up. Carolyn Blake, from Director General from Public Services and Procurement. We have Tabitha Bull, who's Chief Operating Officer for the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Sam Dam, President of Foxwise Technology and CLAW Environmental Services. Mohan Doneto, Director of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, and Vanessa Mountain, Director of 4 Hour Future Indigenous Economic Corp. So I think we're probably short a chair, so we're going to improvise here. And I'm going to get Mohan or somebody. I get to stand. I'm going to stand. I'm going to stand. So that was meant for me? Okay. Oh, there's 5 chairs. Sorry, I can't count. Okay. Just sit on. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of what the panel's objective is that we want to engage in a robust discussion on the barriers to achieve increased Indigenous participation in the federal procurement and what needs to be done to reach the recently announced objective of minimum 5% of federal procurement and going into Indigenous business. So that's what we're going to try to achieve during this panel discussion. But before we dive right into it, I'm going to give a moment for each of the panelists to basically introduce themselves. So, Caroline, please.
Okay, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour, bon après-midi tout le monde. I'm thrilled to be here amongst colleagues and friends on this panel, and certainly talking to this audience around Indigenous procurement. So I've been with Public Services and Procurement Canada for about 4 years now as Director General for strategic policy for procurement. And so I support both the defense and non-defense procurement branches within the department. And essentially what PSPC does is we're a service provider and a partner across government departments and agencies in their businesses of procuring goods, services, construction. And so we are there to support them and ensure that those procurements take place in the most timely, transparent, and effective manner to achieve all objectives. So, thank you.
Tabitha Indigenous Cost, Nipsing Indigenaba, Mijisi Dem. Good afternoon. My name is Tabitha Bull. As David said, I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. We have been working really hard on the procurement file with government on some research that has helped to lead to the 5% target. So we were really pleased to see that, and really great to have this panel and have more discussion on this really timely issue. And at CCAB, we have developed a procurement tool that's currently being used by 62 large corporations within Canada, and we've seen some great results through that tool. So we want to share a little bit about that as well. So, miigwech.
Hi, my name's Sam Dam. I'm the founder and president of Foxwise Technologies and Claw Environmental Services. Really excited to be here today to give an entrepreneur's perspective, I guess, around procurement, Indigenous procurement, the 5% that everyone's talking about. Little aside, I'm just proud of the fact that on Sunday, Foxwise Technology turned 20 years old. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mohan Donetto. I'm Director General of Economic and Business Opportunities with Indigenous Services Canada. Very pleased to be here today, and like to thank the Algonquin Nation for welcoming us to their unceded territory. Basically, I've been with the federal government for about 20 years. I hate to say it, feeling a bit old, and been with Indigenous Services Canada and its predecessors for about 9 years. Had the privilege of working for about a little over 3 years in Dene country up in Yellowknife, Chief Dry Geese territory. Saw from the operational perspective how big procurements work and the benefits that could flow from that. And now very pleased to be working on this file back in headquarters.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vanessa Mountain. I'm a member of the St'át'imc Nation in the southwestern interior of British Columbia. I've been involved with Indigenous procurement for coming up, I would say, 12, 15 years, somewhere in there. I was the specialist for Aboriginal procurement for the 2010 Games in Vancouver. So that's where I got my start, and I've been basically working on an Indigenous procurement file for the last 8 years as well.
Super. So if I had to reduce the panel discussion to 2 words, they would be 5%. The government stated that they intend to increase, as we've been talking most of the day about, the procurement level to be the minimum 5% for all federal procurement. To achieve this, they have what they have is material impact. So to achieve that, they want to have that material impact on the Indigenous businesses, job creation, wealth creation, and of course community economic development. So it's right across the board in terms of being able to build up Indigenous communities and Indigenous wealth and people in general. So when I look at if it's implemented correctly, this policy with the 5%, this will have an enormous impact on the Indigenous community, and I think we all agree on that aspect. And fortunately for us, we have an excellent panel, as you can see, to help us work through this question on how we're going to do great procurement. And most of all, meet that 5% objective and go beyond that 5% objective. So, however, before we get into the two words, the 5%, what we're going to try to do is divide this discussion into three areas that I believe are critical for increasing meaningful participation in the Indigenous businesses and the federal procurement, generally speaking. So the 5% target specifically around access, capacity, and metrics. So when we talk about access, the ability for Indigenous businesses to truly have access to federal opportunities. And that could be also, when you look at it, the federal opportunities will be also corporations that are also supplying to the federal opportunities, so the subcontracting agreements and so on and so forth. So, and the ability to bid and have enough knowledge to bid in the marketplace. So when you look at capacity, capacity is access to capacity, meeting minimum security clearances, and I'm pretty sure Sam has some ideas around that because he's gone through the same pain that I did with regard to security requirements, meeting corporate requirements. We often think about those, and understanding the complex federal procurement. Just those are the few barriers around that. So when we talk about metrics, is how we're monitoring today. Building those strategies to overcome the barriers, and meaningfully moving from the yardstick to achieve the stated goal of 5%. And we talked about it being the floor, and to go beyond. So from its current procurement, which is less than 1%, and then this basically has been repeated over again. So it's less than 1%, and I'm going to bear that in mind. So today, that's what we're trying to do: move from less than 1% to that 5% goal within a certain time period. So it's not an easy task. But I'm pretty sure the panel can get into it. So let's start with the access to government to maintain databases for Indigenous businesses. However, these databases are tiny subsets of each other. So for example, CCAB has one, we talked a little bit about earlier, not to steal thunder from this morning. The CERNAC or ISC has its database, which has a different subset. And you can see where I'm going. And also, the AFIs are part of that database too, the companies that are within the AFI network, so on and so forth. So how we get the businesses across Canada, and we assume that, that there's a national capital region basis for having that database. So with the first question I'd like to pose to the panel, what are the barriers to expanding the database to be more inclusive, like policy, regulation, legislative, and resource? So maybe I'll start with PSPC. They hand out all the contracts.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, databases. That is a really key element to us moving forward with meeting this new government commitment. So our minister's mandate letter was very clear in terms of setting this new target of 5% and working really in close partnership with Indigenous Services Canada and Treasury Board Secretariat to be able to ensure that we've got the right policy structures and frames to enable all of government to be able to work with us in achieving this target. Now, in terms of barriers to the database of businesses, I think part of the challenges we face now is, as you highlight, there are a few databases that exist. There's emerging ones that are also being created. And, at the end of the day, for PSPC as the procurement entity, where do we go to? So which database do you rely on? And how is the databases or directories of businesses being maintained, being managed? Is it up to date? How do we ensure that we, have as much outreach to Indigenous businesses as we would like to be able to participate in our federal procurement?
How about you, Tabitha? When you talk about the databases, I know Corporate Canada goes into your database to look for Indigenous suppliers, to actually participate. And sometimes it's the IPC or the Indigenous participation component that drives them to look at that. So what's your opinion on that databases?
Yeah, so I think, as you said, there are a number of different databases out there of Indigenous businesses, even within the provinces as well. So BC would have an Aboriginal business directory, all the provinces do, but we really need to work collectively, not to each be building our own database, but to be building a national Indigenous directory of businesses. We also need to be looking at the certification and recertification of those businesses. So in my mind, the real barrier right now is resources. There's not one organization that is resourced appropriately to hold that database, to maintain and ensure that those businesses are still in business on a regular basis. So we have a database of about 10,000 Indigenous businesses that we use for research. But then as members, we have 500 certified Aboriginal businesses that have been certified as 51% owned and controlled by an Indigenous person. So even we need to do more work to get those 10,000 into our procurement supply chain for corporate Canada. But I think another barrier is really about awareness. So awareness of, the PSAB program. We did some research with the list of 10,000 Indigenous businesses, and only 31% of them have bid on a contract with the Government of Canada. So if they're not aware of the programs that are out there, then we're not going to be able to get them to market. So I think awareness and resources are really the key barriers.
Maybe I could flip the question a little bit to you, Sam, in terms of what is the accountability for an Indigenous business to participate in that database? How do you see it? What are the barriers for getting, let's say, Indigenous Inc. to participate?
Yeah. So I agree with Tabitha. I think it's important. I think we need less databases, not more. I think, I think I might be moving ahead a little bit, but I think that the government should kind of release that to an RFP or something, a set-aside RFP, and there should be a bid, and we should have. I would hope an Indigenous organization that would be in charge of looking after that database and certifying the Indigenous businesses. So
it's a good one.
Yeah.
So releasing an RFP, now that begs the next question with me, because I got a business analyst hat on right now. So going to Mr. Donato and Mohan. So going to Mohan and looking at it and saying, what would be the dream view of, let's say, to be able to devolve yourself from the databases and responsibility, and then the flip side of it, what would be from the government standpoint, like one of the major objectives, if there was one centralized database and there was one RFP that went out?
Sure, thanks, David. So I think, if you talk about the dream, I think, our government has communicated the big picture often about getting out of the business, right? Devolution of our programs and services. So this certainly would be one of them. Understanding that government as a purchaser will always be the organization making the purchases and running the procurement processes, but there are many aspects of our program that are probably apt for devolution to an Indigenous partner. So completely agree we need to go down that path. We'll have to work out some of the hows and whys and whens. Some decisions will need to be taken. But definitely that is the overall objective of actually creating Indigenous Services Canada, is to push those businesses or those services out over time. Just on the notion of database, I'll just give you some reflections of some of the input we heard. We did national consultations, as Minister Van Dal had mentioned, over the past year and a half or so, and there was a lot of feedback on the database. One thing that a lot of respondents mentioned is it needs to be more flexible. And so one thing we have to do is have a frank and open discussion about what is an Indigenous business. And that can get a bit controversial at times, but I think we have to confront that. Some of the respondents in our engagement said that the definition was too inflexible. Some of them liked that it was quite restrictive, and so it narrowed down the field of Indigenous businesses. So I think we need to understand what the definition is today and whether we keep that definition going forward. But I will say one thing, whether we go to one big database or multiple databases, maybe through recognized organizations, one thing that Indigenous business needs, one thing that government needs is certainty, right? And so if you have a database, the frontline procurement officer who has 6 months to get a procurement out on the street that may be valued at $100 million, they need to be aware of their timelines. They need to know what the authoritative source is for Indigenous businesses. They need to know they can go to that directory and get a list of Indigenous businesses to do procurement with. The same thing for Indigenous businesses. They need to know which directory they need to register in to get access. So I see your point of having one big directory. That said, that is a challenge to maintain one big directory and make it current, make it active, make sure the registrations are up to date. So maybe there's a middle point where we could have a number of directories that are valid, but create a bit of an ecosystem of directories that are verified, that maybe rely on an innovative IMIT platform to keep them up to date, and so that both parties, government, the purchaser, and the supplier have the certainty they need to access procurement, but also to do a procurement process within reasonable timelines.
So now, that's an interesting approach to create an ecosystem, where there's data being exchanged between databases. Yeah, so that's pretty innovative in my opinion, of a view than having one big created database. But and that way the business can focus in, or different organization can focus on the constituency. I like that idea as an analyst. Vanessa, it was a great segue actually from what Mohan was saying about the realities of, let's say, corporate Canada on your side, because once point in time you're with BC Hydro and on the procurement side, and you have to look out into those databases. Oh, sorry, I was supposed to repeat that. Just a little backstory with Vanessa. I was Indigenous Inc. We're getting onto BC Hydro's as part of us being an Indigenous supplier, so I went through the process.
And it was very much a tedious database that we did have. I actually got rid of it because 2/3 of the businesses that were in there were no longer in business. And I guess forgot that they were in there, so they never deleted their information. So it was becoming very unreliable, so we got rid of it. The piece about, Mohan, that you mentioned about the definition of an Aboriginal business, that's another big thing that we struggled with, not only at the Olympic Committee, but at the other job. And it's one of those things that sometimes a First Nation does not do a 51% owner type partnership or JV, but yet because it's not 51%, they don't get the job or the contract. Yet the partnership that they have with the business is actually probably doing more for them than just awarding or winning the contract. So it's of the mind that how you do your business, it's none of our business. So if a First Nation puts a business forward, maybe this is our partner, we're going to submit a proposal to this RFP that's out there. So I think it needs to be considered, because not all of them work 51% controlled, so that's a consideration I think that needs to be in there. And the whole thing about databases, one would be great, but it's the whole keeping it up to date. How long do you certify them for? How long do you leave it there? If it's not, how many times are you going to remind them to go in and update their information? So it's all, who's going to do that? That's a lot of work.
So this brings us to a good question. We've been really hitting on it with the ability to audit the veracity of the information. If we're to blue sky a little bit, just pretend anything's possible. Yeah. How would we create that audit capability and that veracity? It's a tough question, because we do talk about the problems. But sometimes we're just looking through the lens of what if the art of the possible was anything, what would that be? So maybe from a PSPC point of view, when you think about the pain points that you go through.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it comes back to, you know, some of the points that are being raised here, which is, first, I think the ideal is we've got to sort of aim for something simple, right? If, like, the complexities and the web of current directories or databases or lists of Indigenous businesses and different approaches in terms of how they get on those lists makes it really challenging, right? From a public procurement standpoint, to determine, well, you know, is that a legitimate directory, and if it is, or even if it isn't, how are we positioned to be able to verify that? So in terms of that verification or that audit capability, well, we don't do that right now. We certainly don't do that at PSPC, but really take, you know, within sort of the scope of the contracting provisions, you know, the identification and self-determination of individuals and their business nature. But that being said, I mean, you also want to create a level playing field so that it's fair, it's you know, in terms of access and process. So how do we navigate all those complexities going forward? And I think some of the ideas are being raised here. I think it's you know, I think we're in that space now, and with this target in front of us, with a very deliberate mandate commitment, we're, you know, really rolling up our sleeves trying to tackle some of these core issues, because they are foundational to achieving any target. We do need to sort of set sort of clear guidance around how to get on either a business directory or of some sort or another, and who would manage that, are key to this puzzle. So, yeah.
Tabitha, if we devolve it, let's say, to the organizations and to your constituency, how would you see a database being put out there that will be useful for government, useful for your corporate clients to be able to suss out Indigenous businesses for their projects?
So, you know, there are some great examples out there, and the platform that we've built has been built on an example in Australia, which I was not here this morning, but it may have been spoke about. So they have a program called Supply Nation that was funded originally by the federal government in Australia to meet a target of 3% procurement from Indigenous businesses, which is reflective of the Aboriginal population in Australia. It is an open access database, so, which is very important, and the Indigenous businesses do not have to pay to be part of that database. Supply Nation is also funded to do the certification and to recertify the Indigenous businesses, but the definition of an Indigenous business, Supply Nation has reserved the right as an Indigenous organization, an Indigenous-led organization, to have their own definition. It doesn't actually match the government's definition, so there's 2 tiers within Supply Nation, and that might be something that could be considered. You know, if it's not 51% owned, is the community getting 51% of the benefit of the project instead of an ownership or a controlled perspective? Maybe that's a consideration in the definition. So I think it's very important that it's open. So that Supply Nation directory in Australia is open to everyone. You can go on the website at any time and find a business. So even so, for government and for corporate Canada. But I think we also need to. So in the platform that we have called the Aboriginal Procurement Marketplace, there's about 600 businesses in there, and the key part is that if you're a corporate champion and looking to procure from Indigenous business, you have to name someone in your procurement team that Indigenous businesses can go to, so that there's a champion within your organization. So Indigenous businesses don't have to search through and try to find who they might be able to get a procurement deal with. But it's also searchable in that you can go in and find within the region, within the sector, an Indigenous business that fits what you're looking for. And then export that into your own procurement tool. Because I think it may not be that this database is the procurement tool that government uses, but if they can go in and do a search and pull those businesses out on a regular basis into their procurement tool, then we don't have to continue to tie into the government's procurement plan.
Super. Actually, I'm looking at Mohan, actually, because we talked about champions. And PSAB has different departmental champions. What role do you think that the PSAB coordinators have within the databases? Yeah. And would a database make their lives easier? And to be able to, support the departments and getting Indigenous suppliers involved in the, say, supply chain of a department?
Well, for the coordinators, I think they play a very important role. We have the policy applies to about 62 departments, and we have a network of about 60 coordinators embedded in each department. They tend to be manager level or sometimes working level. That's good. You need it at every level of the organization. But I think when we talk about the champion idea, and that was one of the recommendations also of the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, to have a champion, perhaps of a higher level, right, in each department. And would that person be the head of corporate services, or would that person be someone like me who has a policy vocation or program vocation for Indigenous business or business in general? But I think there could be some benefit in looking at that. Having someone internally to drive that 5% target, I think, is important, because what we hear from our coordinators network is often they're committed, they're extremely committed, but they have a tough job kind of communicating upwards. And so if you had someone in the mid and high levels of the organization who also had that job of communicating to their colleagues, communicating at the senior management tables, I think that would be very beneficial.
I'm going to go over to Vanessa here because she worked in utilities. I'm going to pick on her on the utility side, but also, but also look at the economic development, the corporation that you're running, and what an impact of that would be, a database where the departments are looking into.
I'll go back to VANOC because we did have a database that we went to, and it was put together by the province, the Small Business Ministry of the province of BC, and they had what they called the 2010 Commerce Center, which any business could go to, but they did have a specific business directory that they would send to me each month. And yes, I was the designated person for VANOC for Indigenous businesses. So needless to say, I was pretty darn busy, but it was fun, so it was a good thing. The corporation I'm sort of a director of right now it's a little different than an economic development corporation. We're a smaller, thanks for the plug by the way, we're a smaller group that we've just come together, and we're there to help the businesses, to help the communities, to bring some training to businesses or whomever would like it on how do I get into business. How do I build a procurement policy? How do I do a procurement strategy if that's all I want? So we're more on the helping side. And I think, I'm probably jumping the gun here on something, but I understand that a lot of Indigenous businesses, especially the smaller ones, they have difficulty replying to these big proposals. And that's where they need help, and that's sometimes where they won't even bother because it's like, 200 pages of requirements or specs or something, and they just don't want to have to bother reading that, yet they could probably do the job. So that's another thing I think that has to be looked at from both sides, actually. Yeah.
Super. Yeah, you're getting into one of the biggest challenges is trying to do business with government. So we're going to get a little bit into that further. One last thing, I would save this one for Sam. What is the role of private industry and the Indigenous organizations to overcome the issue of restrictions? Some of them, you have to have a membership in order to be part, to get access to that database. And that kind of turns off some companies into, let's say, to get that database and suddenly build their own or do some outreach or put someone in procurement. How would you're an Indigenous business, you want to get noticed, you want to be able to reach out to both corporate Canada and government at the same time. What would you recommend for the access to the databases?
Yeah, so I think it's important for corporate Canada to get on board and really build and develop their Indigenous procurement programs. I think those programs drive everything else. So because we've all seen varying levels and degrees of Indigenous procurement programs, and we see people winning awards based on their Indigenous procurement programs, but ask them how much they've procured from Indigenous business. I think that's the important piece is what are they doing? Why should an Indigenous company approach this potential corporate client? Because I know that sometimes we get in a situation where it can be a waste of time. It's window dressing. It's a feel-good thing. Are they really serious? Do they have an Indigenous procurement strategy? And I find that it's hit and miss for me. So I think depending on the strength of their procurement program, there's things that have to happen, like a database or a membership or something. And for my organization, we just do what needs to be done. If we have a client that we've targeted for whatever reason, they fit into our product mix or something, we go after them and we do what we need to do to do business with them. Yeah.
So if I was just to basically kind of hit some key points, part of it's education about access. The other part of it is, we just spent a lot of time talking about the database, about building a database correctly, but also the fact is about access to corporate Canada, and how do you make those things easier for them, for Indigenous businesses to be procured by both government and corporate Canada, supplying to government. So if we're to move on to capacity, this is arguably the largest issue to overcome. It's not easy to do business with the federal government, as you pointed out, right? So, and it's not even easy for large multinationals who have a tremendous amount of horsepower to do business with government. So just to put that in perspective. So how do we quickly increase the federal market opportunities for Indigenous businesses already providing products and services today to government? And there are really good Indigenous companies that are doing very, very well within the federal space. So how do we build them up and put them on steroids or pour gasoline on these already existing successful businesses? Maybe I'll go to Sam there.
Make the program mandatory. That's what I feel has to happen. That's number one. Okay. We have the PSAP program that's been in place since '96. Most of it is voluntary, and we haven't made the numbers that we thought we were making. I think it needs to be a mandatory program first and foremost. Yeah. Legislative.
Let's switch over to Mohan. What would be the impact of mandatory be in terms of, how would you say, when we extend, let's say, to a program, let's say outside, a government program's in the national interest, you say, we're going to make this, a capacity, Indigenous capacity being a mandatory requirement, and we want you to respond to it. There's a knee-jerk reaction, I know, from corporate Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, right? If you look at government, so, getting to the scale of procurement that the federal government does, it's huge. The federal government is the largest single organization in the country, bar none, the biggest. So we purchase a lot, we do it large scale, we have to have economies of scale. So as you mentioned, any business is going to be challenged procuring with us because certain aspects of it need to be complex. So I think one aspect that we're really working on, and PSPC especially is working on, are Indigenous benefit plans within large contracts, right? Because I think when you look at our numbers, we're only talking about the 100% set-aside contracts solely to Indigenous business through a competitive process. We currently don't track the benefits under larger contracts. So I think we need to really push that angle because it is going to be challenging for smaller businesses, no matter Indigenous or not, to get into a large-scale procurement, just because of the nature of the scale, the commodities, and other factors. But we're having conversations with the private sector, who I think are ahead of government in some ways, in terms of working with prime contractors to build in those plans, whether it's training, development, subcontracts, or what have you. And I think we can drive a lot of benefits there. And I think we don't have the data right now, but I think we're doing a lot, and we need to collect the data, which we'll get to later in the panel, to make sure we understand. In terms of mandatory or not, I think that's one option. We do have models in the land claims, the most recent being the Nunavut land claim, where we have mandatory consideration. So there's a slight nuance. So it's basically the onus is on government to first consider an Inuit business in the Nunavut land claim area if there are 2 or more businesses on the business list maintained by the Inuit, that demonstrate capacity from, from a theoretical standpoint. So it's a first consideration, and that is mandatory, but the result is not necessarily mandatory, right? So still competitive process, or if the capacity isn't there, then it's an open competition. So I think there's, the model exists right now in Nunavut, and there's a directive, and it's a land claim obligation. So I think we're gaining some experience there. There are other measures like transparency. Transparency is extremely effective. Basically, you reveal what you've done. There was a suggestion from the National Indigenous Economic Development Board to have a third-party, arm's-length Indigenous organization review government progress and performance on this. Why not, right? Kind of open up the books and let's see what we've done and challenge ourselves and have a third party challenge us. So I think there's a lot of benefit to looking at that as well, which we currently don't do. We do reporting on PSAB. The data is a challenge, so we're behind on the reporting, but we don't have a regular public reporting mechanism. We don't, some of the data is disclosed on open government, not all of it, and we don't have any third-party organization mandated to review our performance. So I think it's all part of the mix, including mandatory. Right. We have to consider that.
Super. I got a question for you. So, around, what's the, is there a greater role for Indigenous participation components, the IPC, or the Indigenous benefit plans, especially around what we call generational procurement, where I can start on working on the project, and my children can finish working on it. So that kind of thing, and that has a major impact, especially when we're trying to do generational shift within in Indigenous communities. So, is there right now capacity building is underrepresented groups by Indigenous companies that are, let's say, in aerospace or high tech? Is that a vehicle to build that capacity within that framework of the IPCs?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm nodding away because absolutely that is a vehicle that, so we've been using Indigenous benefit plans for last few years, I would say, more deliberately. I think it was a bit more ad hoc in the past, but with our modernization of procurement agenda, we've been looking at different approaches, different vehicles, different mechanisms to be able to boost up the capacity as well as the participation of Indigenous businesses. So we found that through the Indigenous benefit plans, it's a good vehicle and a fair vehicle to allow and engage with larger corporations, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, but to be able to present some opportunities for Indigenous businesses and Indigenous peoples in communities and also at the local level to build up, either training, capacity, skills development, or subcontracting opportunities through these IBPs. So it is a good vehicle, and it's proving to be, quite, giving us some good results. We're still, I would not call it early days, but we are getting our bearings around how to best apply it and when to apply it. And really, the magic is early engagement. Early engagement is key to a successful sort of outcome of these processes, of these procurement processes. So what we're trying to do is do a lot more outreach, early engagement through either industry days. We do requests for information. We do a lot of communication and outreach and direct sort of community engagement to be able to assess, what is the capacity like? Where can we best align some of those complementary sort of objectives and needs in through our procurement strategies? So IBPs is successful, and we've got some good examples where we are seeing some demonstrable results. From coast to coast. We're also leveraging our Office of Small and Medium Enterprise, and I know OSME, I think we have a booth in the other room, but through our regional presence and national presence through this office, we do provide some services and support to various Indigenous businesses, small, medium, large, but to be able to engage them in how to do business, how to prepare to do business with the federal government, how to, and how to do some of the outreach, and so there are some opportunities through that vehicle. We have. We've also established an agreement with CANDU and our Office of Small and Medium Enterprise to be able to leverage and partner together in how do we sort of get some capacity going across various sectors and across various communities where Indigenous businesses lie, so we can be more proactive and anticipate what is coming forward into the future. But you talked about generational procurement, or these large procurements, and coming back to that. So yes, IBPs is certainly a very important vehicle to be able to achieve some of those opportunities and economic sort of benefits that stem from that. The Industrial Technological Benefits Program that defense procurements are subject to also embed Indigenous benefits and Indigenous opportunities through those through the design of those ITBs. So there's multiple levels of opportunities where we can really align our interests in order to be able to achieve those common goals of economic development and sustainable ones at that. And I take the example of the National Shipbuilding Strategy. I believe so. Last year, 2 years ago, when we published a federal government report in the context of a government committee on small medium enterprise, but also on Indigenous businesses. So we talked about the National Shipbuilding Strategy and how it was successful in training across a number of skills and trades over 14 or 1,500 Indigenous peoples and businesses as part of the National Shipbuilding Strategy, to be able to prepare ourselves to be able to leverage that capacity across on both coasts, right? So both the west and the east coasts.
So maybe this is a question for you, it's Tabitha. And I'm going to switch over to Sam after that on the same kind of vein. Industry days, they're critical in terms of helping government define requirements and achievable requirements for Indigenous businesses to participate. Notwithstanding the fact that there's also an opportunity for Indigenous businesses to network and meet government officials, but also meet other vendors that are, and especially the prime on these particular programs. So, however, these events are poorly attended by Indigenous businesses. Yes. I think I went to the Future Fighter program and I was the only Indigenous business there. And that was a bit of a tragedy. I was hoping to see more. So from Tabitha, how would you get your constituencies, your members, driving towards industry days? And Sam, what would you be looking for to say, you know what, I'm going to go to industry days. This is worth it for me to go there.
I think again, it's about awareness. We do something similar, sector-based as well. So with some corporate champions, and those have been really successful. And so with Ontario Power Generation, as an example, we've done 2 supplier days where we've gone into our membership and Indigenous businesses that we know are interested in supplying to OPG. And they have brought their purchasers and subcontractors as well. It's a bit more of a safe space in that it's Indigenous only suppliers. And the focus is really on how we're rebuilding the Indigenous procurement strategy within that corporation. I would suggest that the government partner with an Indigenous organization to bring those members together and to have a day that's really focused on Indigenous businesses. Right. So it's not as a small Indigenous businesses, some are going to be a bit lost or feel they may be lost within the large number of people that are there or have been there before as well, right? Because we have seen real success and good contracts for Indigenous businesses out of those days that we've had, and OCNI has them. I mean they do exist, and really that they're sector based, so really focused on certain sectors. And out of that too, some of those days aren't just a booth, but there's an opportunity for real networking. So we have like a speed chat networking event, kind of like a speed dating between businesses. But then you're able to get that one-on-one conversation and then follow up later.
Super. How about you, Sam? As an Indigenous business on Industry Days, getting lost in the din of with these large procurements.
Yeah, for me, it's always a question of why should I go? What you know, it's expensive and it's time away from the business in a sense. So why go? I guess it depends on a few things. Like, so what is their interest? Do they have an Indigenous procurement strategy again? How much have they procured with Indigenous business? Like I guess I got asked to participate in this because I am an Indigenous entrepreneur, and my companies are both certified with, CCAB and with Indigenous Affairs and Public Works and everything, and we've done a lot of business over the years. But a lot of this stuff can be a waste of time. There's these ideas that corporations have that they want to get involved with Indigenous procurement, but it's a challenge. And I've gone to a lot of meetings and I've wasted a lot of time talking to companies that have this program or have this need or want, but we're just kind of spinning our tires. And then with regards to Indigenous participation, that's makes me nervous because with regards to some large contracts that I've bid on with the federal government, they've had this Indigenous participation, and they've had these large companies write these beautiful bids. An RFP goes out, and they have these amazing bids, and they have bid teams and lawyers and everything, and they write a great piece around Indigenous participation, and they win the business, and nothing happens. So it's curious for me, like, how do they report on that? How do we know that those things are actually happening? From a subcontracting perspective, because I know in my two businesses, I've seen large non-Indigenous companies win these with these great hiring plans and subcontracting and all that, and I know nothing's happened.
Yeah.
So that's the thing for me. It's understanding who is putting on the industry day, who's going to be there, and are they for real? Yeah. And I try to go to my list, like I work closely with CCAB and try to scrutinize as much as I can before I invest the time in participating.
I just share my own experience with Industry Days because one of our biggest bids was found on an Industry Day bid. It was the FNIB's claims processing. What I was able to do in that during the dialogue with government was be able to say these are right requirements. One of the things you got to measure, 25% spend. Then you got to put penalties behind it. In order to basically get the prime to respect the terms of the industry, the Indigenous participation component, and let Corporate Canada and Indigenous Inc. work together in order to come up with a good participation component or strategy. And with the beauty of the whole thing about it is when the bid actually rolled out, all those requirements were in there. And I think I was represented by 2 or 3 different Indigenous companies. So from my point of view, we have to participate in that. And we have to find a way to get the constituency of more Indigenous businesses rolling into helping build those requirements that are meaningful from that standpoint. So this is just a little bit of thought for the crowd, because we've got 2 different perspectives here. So one of the things we also talked about, and I'd be really remiss if I did not talk about access to capital. This is documented, it's understood, and so the question to me, I have my own personal experience with access to capital. Thank you, BDC. Shout out to BDC. Thank you. Because they expanded. So how do we get? What needs to be done to improve access to capital? And maybe we'll take it from Sam, you're in a hot seat again, being an Indigenous business. What would be, in your point of view?
I'm probably not the best person to ask on this one because
think of the early days.
The early days, I grew both my companies on a shoestring. Started off very, very small. Reinvested the money back into the company and grew it organically. So I have never really had luck accessing any First Nation grants or First Nation or Indigenous small business grants. So I grew my businesses, I guess, like traditionally just by starting small, reinvesting, and growing that way. So.
What about you, Vanessa? What do you think on this access to capital?
Well, I don't know, a lot of you know or not, I was the general manager of Telehout, Aboriginal Capital Corporation. I won't say how many years ago. And it's been a continuing issue, is the whole access to capital. And it's trying to put all the pieces together to get the funding, the loans, the grants, just to get a loan to start a one-person business. And the loan applications, the cash flows, again, it comes to the education and the capacity of the small business. And again, it's an issue of getting enough capital together to be able to get your business on the go.
Tabitha, you have any thoughts around that with your Indigenous businesses you're working with, large and small?
So mostly really information. So together with NIDB and NACA, CCAB participated in a study with the OECD, and there was a lot of discussion out of that on access to capital. And some of the discussions there, I mean, this is not CCAB's role, it's really NACA's and the AFI's, but the ability for the AFIs to be more flexible with how they're able to provide capital to businesses was something that came up as something that really needs to be considered. And I think also we see from some of our businesses, there's a gap in getting to the next tier. So maybe they have a started business and it's starting to be, a functioning business, and it's great, but there's a gap there in how they get capital in order to move to the next tier, to become an exporter or to become a larger business. And I think like Jeff Sir and Raven Capital are filling some of those gaps, but there is a need for a capital market in that second tier as well that we need to be looking at.
Super. So in my humble opinion, if we're going to make a difference, and we need to bring federal procurement to Indigenous communities that don't come to Ottawa. So they're out in the regions, they're out in the communities, to be holistic. Seems that federal procurement is Ottawa-centric. So I'm going to ask a question regarding how can we bring procurement to the community? And maybe that's a PSPC question. And,
well, I'll kick it off for sure, and I'll look to other colleagues here. But
I'm not really picking on you a lot.
No, and is it an Ottawa thing? Well, I mean, it's when we're talking about public procurement and federal procurement, I mean, we are buying for the delivery of government services in our operations where those may be and where those take place. So, but they're not Ottawa-centric. I mean, they're happening across the landscape. And so the way we're structured at PSPCs, we do have regional offices from coast to coast to coast. I mean, through, including representatives from our Office of Small and Medium Enterprises, but we also have other components of our operations that operate across the landscape, because we do recognize that, there is a need, and we do need to do the outreach throughout the communities with the Indigenous businesses and the Indigenous people where they are. I mean, if we are going to be able to leverage and generate some local opportunities and benefits, we have to go and talk to those, local organizations in order to be able to get that intel around the market capabilities of those businesses and how they will meet our needs. So, is it all Ottawa-centric? No. I mean, is there a good portion that is Ottawa-centric? Perhaps. I don't have the stats, top of mind in terms of distribution of, our federal spending on an annual basis. But I guess, I'm thinking more when we speak about some of these topics around public procurement. One of the key things we also have been doing at the federal level is engaging a lot more conversations with our public procurement partners. So those are at the provincial, territorial level, but also at the municipal level. Because just at the federal government level, Mohan, you mentioned earlier, we are the largest public procurement buyer. We spend anywhere between 22 billion or up to even 25 billion on an annual basis. But if you add the provincial, territorial, and municipal spending, public spending to that, you get closer to a $200 billion annual spend. And so there's a lot of opportunity across a landscape in working together through public procurement opportunities to be able to leverage that. And so we've got agreements now where we're meeting on a regular basis with our provincial and territorial partners to see how we can partner together and share procurement methods of supply. For example, our supply arrangement or standing offers, we're making them available to our provincial counterparts so that they can buy through those. And so the key for us is ensuring that on those methods of supply, we have as much Indigenous participation so that they're listed there for those opportunities that can be leveraged through those tools.
Just on that, Tabitha, you mentioned the Supply Nation model. I do think we need to look to partners to help us with that. And I just want to shout out to Keith Matthews there. I won't put you on the spot, Keith, but he has an MOU with OSME, the PSPC, the Office of Small and Medium Enterprises. So, through arrangements like that with partners, I think we can have better reach right into the community. So Keith's organization develops and trains economic development officers that are embedded in communities. So if they're trained up and they have the knowledge, then we have better access and there's better linkages between communities and procurement officials. We also, as Carolyn mentioned, we have regional offices in our department. In fact, right after this, my director, John Duraldis, is meeting with Associate Regional Director Generals from across the country who happen to be in Ottawa, and they're going to talk about procurement and how we can do better as a department, because not only do we have kind of the policy role of Indigenous procurement, but also as a department, Indigenous Services needs to do better with our own spend. So certainly we do a lot, and there's more that can be done as well, including working through Indigenous partners to help us out.
Super. Tabitha, what's your when you look at your constituency, nationally, what would you recommend? Queen for a day for the government.
So I think this idea about industry days, if they were in regional offices, so that you're really, if there's a big project coming, you're talking to the communities that are nearby and have employment in those regions. So if there's going to be a large project launched, then have the industry day in the region where the businesses are. The other thing I would say is there's so much opportunity. So we did a research study funded by the federal government that showed that businesses today, 54,000 Indigenous businesses in Canada today, can supply 24% of the federal government spend, and in almost every sector. So we looked specifically at their North American codes in the different sectors, and there was only 4 sectors where today we couldn't provide 5% to meet the mandate. So the capacity is there. I think there is an unconscious or maybe a conscious bias that the capacity isn't there. So we need to build the awareness across government that there are significant numbers of businesses out there that can meet the demand to get to the 5%. And we don't need to be looking at all of the fighter jets, but what about building maintenance and catering? And in all of the national, federal buildings across the country, you could get to 5% within just your pens and coffee. And there are so many small Indigenous businesses near those buildings that are operating that could start to move the dial in regional areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Desiree Regions, and a little shout out, no she's here or not, but she builds these hazmat suits and manufactures hazmat suits. So that's completely indirect spend that they can take advantage of.
And she's so she does a lot of great work with corporate OPG and Bruce Power on nuclear, but I will tell you, I hope she doesn't mind this. So when the PSAB engagements were happening, I went to some of our members and said, how is this working? Have you done this? And Victoria gave me some good input as well on that we could really bring back to contribute. And I called Desiree, and she had never applied. Like, she hadn't even gone through the process of PSAP. And she is a incredible Indigenous woman-owned business who's doing incredible work with nuclear associations. So definitely is accredited and bonded and, you know, has everything that she would need to get into the PSAP, but was not aware of the program.
Super. We're going to push this over. Are we missing anything for having a collaborative opportunity? I'll push this over to Sam, and I'll push this over to Vanessa. So Sam, did we miss anything here on being able to collaborate, have better collaboration to get remote Indigenous businesses involved?
Yeah, another tough one for me. Sorry. I felt that I needed to be in Ottawa to build my business. I know that's not what a lot of people want to hear, but you know, I feel a lot of opportunities are derived out of headquarters and then pushed out to the regions. There seems to be a lot of very large procurements now. So I felt that, you know, I needed to be here knocking on the doors, meeting with government. Like it's great if you're in a community north of 60, you can respond to anything that's posted on buy and sell. That's, you know, that's great. That the access is there from that perspective, so you can download an RFP and put forward a bid. But there's something to be said for, you know, if you've never been to Ottawa before, and where this bid has come from, like, I'm knocking on their door every day. I'm sitting with them every single day, like doing sales, business development. So we get a handle on what opportunities are coming, what are the pain points, what's happening, especially from an IT perspective. And then we need to take that information. If we're a reseller, let's say for somebody like HP, we need to register those opportunities. You know, so if you don't know the opportunities coming and you're not able to register it, you're not going to beat me because I have a pricing advantage, let's say. So that's one thing. So I think it's a major challenge. I don't have the answers, unfortunately. I think it's a big challenge. I know there's lots of business in the regions, there's lots of government buildings in the regions, so how local and regional businesses can access those, I'm not sure, because we see a lot of very large procurements that will handle building maintenance across the country, possibly. Or you know, so those are some of the challenges I see.
How about you, Vanessa? What's your thoughts on that? Are we missing stuff to being more collaborative?
No, I think Sam kind of hit it on the head. It's those little remote communities that aren't in the larger centers that get left out all the time. And they're the ones that come knocking. What can we do in our territory? What work do you have coming that's in our territory? It's a constant question that I would get. Even with Bannock, you know, the games were only happening in certain areas, but you've got these little small businesses up more northern BC saying, look, we want to get involved, how can we get involved? And it's one of those things, well, can you come down here? It's like, well, no, I can't. So, you know, it's a tough pill to swallow for some of them.
But I think understanding the pain points is part, you know, it's a large part of the solution to, you know, to find what are the methods to actually overcome those barriers. Yeah. One of the things I heard was, okay, how do you, maybe it's from a regional point of view, they're saying this is what we need, instead of Ottawa dictating, oh, this is what the regions need. So maybe that's a thought process, kind of reversing the question. So that's one of the things. So I think it's important to understand the pain points and communicate those pain points. And as Indigenous businesses, sometimes we fail to do that. You know, we suffer in silence. So I think more dialogue along those lines. So it's important. I'm glad you raised those pain points.
And maybe I'll just add, because I know, Vanessa, you had raised something earlier, and it just kind of is, you know, kind of on my mind, and this notion of very large, complex RFPs or procurement processes that probably steer away some